Shabbat Shalom and good afternoon. It's been a great weekend with our guest scholar, Dr. Andrew Porwancher so far, hailing originally from Princeton, New Jersey, via Cambridge for his PhD, fellowships across the country, including at Harvard, and now a professor at a University of Oklahoma in Norman, Oklahoma. We're very honored to have Dr. Porwancher here. He is the author of The Jewish World of Alexander Hamilton, and that is his subject for his talk right now. I'll make a note. I hope that you'll also join us tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. for his final lecture in our Weingold Scholar Weekend, with gratitude to the Weingold family as well as our Men's Club and Sisterhood for supporting this program, and everyone behind the scenes, Shani Kadis, our program director, Dr. Rafi Simon, who helped arrange all of our food for the weekend, our staff and maintenance crew, and our volunteers. Very grateful to everyone. It's my honor to welcome once again to our Amud, our Shulchan, our pulpit, Dr. Porwancher.
Thank you so much, Rabbi, for the introduction, for the invitation to be here, to everybody who helped make this weekend possible. I also want to thank the Weingold family, the Men's Club, and the Sisterhood. I'm hugely grateful. It's particularly exciting for me to come to Ohio because I have a lot of happy memories here. My grandparents, for many years when I was growing up, lived in Youngstown and in Warren. And I would come here in the summers. I learned to swim here in the Buckeye State. When the Jacobs Field opened for the first time, I think in the mid-90s. I remember going to games with my grandfather. And so there are a lot of happy memories here. This is, in some ways, a homecoming of sorts. So it brings me a lot of naches. And I've also been grateful to be here with my fiance, who, if you've never met a Jewish Christian before, as I mentioned last night, this might be your one opportunity. So thank you so much. It's an honor and a privilege. Alexander Hamilton was a wanderer in search of promised land. When he left his home in the Caribbean at the age of 18 and set sail for America, Hamilton fixed his eyes on a New Jerusalem. After his mother's death, the courts denied him his inheritance, his birthright, and he had to rely on his keen financial and linguistic skills to survive. His is a story of dispossession, a story of exodus, a story of the search for a homeland. His story is the story of the Jewish people. But Hamilton wasn't merely similar to Jewish immigrants. I believe that Hamilton was himself a Jewish immigrant. And uncovering the truth about Hamilton's origins is not just a matter of historical curiosity. It provides the key to unlocking why, in his American adulthood, Hamilton emerges as a champion of American Jewry against the forces of anti-Semitism. To make the case that Hamilton, in all likelihood, had an identity as a Jew, I would, by traditional halakha, have to address whether his mother, in all likelihood, had an identity as a Jew. And we know that his mother, Rachel, was not born Jewish. And so I have to demonstrate the plausibility that Rachel converts to Judaism prior to Alexander's birth. My case for her conversion begins in 1745 on a sun-kissed island in the Caribbean called St. Croix. Today, St. Croix is part of the U.S. Virgin Islands, but it was at that time a Danish colony. And it is there that Rachel meets and marries a Danish merchant named Johann Michael Levine. It is my thesis today that the balance of evidence suggests that Johann Levine was Jewish, that Rachel converts to Judaism to marry him, and that although she bears Alexander out of wedlock to a non-Jew, still she chooses to raise her son in her adopted faith of Judaism. So let us begin with Johann Levine. Hamilton scholars have long told us that Johann Levine is not Jewish because, supposedly, he's not identified in the Danish land records and census registers from St. Croix as a Jew. The problem is, Hamilton scholars didn't actually bother consulting the original Danish source material from the Caribbean. I went down to the Caribbean and to Copenhagen. I went through the original records. I learned enough Danish to parse them, and I went through 3,000 of these records. What did I find? Well, it turns out that these scholars were actually right. Johann Levine is not identified as a Jew in these records, which would be problematic for my thesis had I not also discovered that every other known Jew on the island is also not identified as Jewish in these records. This is a great example of a piece of evidence that, disaggregated from its context, appears to tell us something important, and yet when placed back in its context, gives us no indication either way of Johann Levine's religious background. Well, what else do we know about Levine? Well, we know that his name was Levine. His name is in many spellings in the primary sources, including Levian, Lavin, Lewin, spellings that match letter for letter how Jews of Levitic descent spelled their surnames in the 18th century. We know he had been working as a merchant, a typical Jewish profession at the time. He was disproportionately likely to conduct business with Jews, and this at a time when Jews tended to conduct business among themselves. And he had come from another Caribbean island that was home to a sizable Jewish community. Hamilton's own grandson explicitly identified Levine as a, quote, rich Danish Jew. Conversely, there's not a shred of evidence in the historical record identifying him as Christian. So if Johann Levine were in all likelihood Jewish, is it possible that Rachel converts to Judaism to marry him? Well, consider this. Johann and Rachel have a son a year after their wedding named Peter Levine, and they do not have their son infant baptized, which was standard practice for island Christians. Decades later, as an adult, Peter Levine moves to South Carolina, and he joins an Anglican church, but in order to join this church, he has to undergo an adult baptism. Well, Anglicans practice infant baptism. Why would the Anglican Church baptize an adult? There are three possible reasons why the Anglican Church might have baptized any given adult. One possibility is if someone grows up Christian, but in a non-Trinitarian sect of Christianity. So most Christian sects baptize people in the name of the Trinity. That is the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. There are some Christian sects that are non-Trinitarian. So if Peter Levine had a non-Trinitarian baptism, it would not have been recognized by the Anglicans as valid, and he would have to be rebaptized, this time in the name of the Trinity. Might this explain Peter Levine's adult baptism? No. There were no Christian sects on St. Croix in those years that practiced non-Trinitarian baptisms. They were exclusively Trinitarian. A second possibility that would explain why Anglicans might baptize a given adult is if the person had grown up Christian, but in a sect that doesn't practice infant baptism. Some Christian sects only practice adult baptism, or what's sometimes called believer's baptism. Could it be that Peter Levine grows up Christian, but in a sect that practiced adult baptism, he simply hadn't had his adult baptism yet, and that's why the Anglicans baptize him? Again, the answer is no. It's not possible because there were no Christian sects on St. Croix in these years that practiced believer's baptism. They categorically did infant baptism. The third and final reason why Anglicans would baptize an adult, the only one that plausibly pertains to Peter Levine, is if he's converting to Christianity. Now, Hamilton scholars who are mired in the assumption that Johann, Rachel, and Peter were all cradle-to-grave Christians are baffled by his need for an adult baptism. But if Johann Levine was Jewish and Rachel converted to Judaism to marry him, that would make Peter a Jew, and his need for an adult baptism, this long-standing mystery among Hamilton scholars, is suddenly easily explained. But that is just one piece of evidence for you to consider. Now, Johann and Rachel have a deeply troubled marriage. He has her imprisoned for infidelity, and when she gets out of prison, she absconds from the island of St. Croix, leaving behind Johann and Peter, and she winds up ultimately on the British Caribbean island of Nevis. And it is there that Rachel bears Alexander out of wedlock to a Scottish colonist named James Hamilton. Now, James Hamilton was unquestionably a Gentile, and yet there are compelling reasons to think that Rachel raises Alexander in her adopted faith of Judaism. Now, if Alexander were born Jewish, we would expect that he would be circumcised. If born Christian, baptized. Unfortunately, there are no surviving circumcision records for any of the Jews that were living on Nevis at that time. There are, however, extant baptismal records which show no entry for Alexander. But even more compelling than that is the fact that Rachel enrolls Alexander in a Jewish school where he begins rudimentary study of the Torah in the original Hebrew. Now, I did not discover that there's no baptismal record. I didn't discover that he went to a Jewish school. These are well-established facts. How have Hamilton biographers made sense of these curiosities? They say, well, he was born out of wedlock, and so he must have been denied an infant baptism on account of his illegitimacy. And if he can't be baptized into the church, he can't go to the church school, and that must be why he goes to the Jewish school. This is a neat and tidy explanation, and one that would be problematic for my thesis had I not gone down to Nevis and gone through those church records and found that on Nevis, and indeed throughout the Caribbean, children born out of wedlock were routinely infant baptized. We have precious little grounds for assuming that Hamilton's illegitimacy goes any way towards explaining the absence of a baptismal record or goes any way towards explaining his enrollment at a Jewish school. Moreover, these Hamilton scholars make a critical error in assuming that a school for Jews would have taken in a child who was considered Christian in that age. Jewish schools were, of course, religious instruments. They existed to turn Jewish children into observant Jewish adults, to instill in these children a strong sense of Jewish identity, to cultivate in them a shared sense of Jewish peoplehood with their co-religionists spread out across the diaspora. And there was a Talmudic prohibition that some people interpreted to prevent Jews from teaching non-Jews the Torah. And so for all of these reasons, the attendance of any given child at a Jewish school creates a strong presumption of that child's Jewish identity. It would be highly unusual for a Christian child to be attending a Jewish school in the 18th century. In fact, it would be more than unusual. It would be unprecedented. I have never found, and no scholar of 18th century Jewish education to whom I've ever consulted has ever found a single instance of a Christian child attending a Jewish school in that era. Moreover, Hamilton scholars err in thinking that a school for Jews would have taken in a Christian child, in part because they misunderstand the nature of Jewish-Christian relations at that time and place. And I want to take a few minutes to unpack this part of the argument because it's really central to the book. In the 18th century, the Caribbean was the center of Jewish life in the Western Hemisphere. There were more Jews living on a single Dutch island in the Caribbean than in the entire continent of North America. Some islands, like the one where Hamilton grows up, Nevis, 25% of the free population is Jewish. On some other islands, it's up to 40% Jewish. Right? These may not be Boca Raton numbers, but they're respectable. Why are there so many Jews on these islands? One word: sugar. The tropical heat and rich soil of the Caribbean made these islands ideal for cultivating sugar, the ultimate cash crop of the 18th century. So lucrative is the Caribbean sugar trade that Britain generated more wealth from its collection of tiny West Indian islands than from all of its North American colonies combined. The French, in treaty negotiations, had to choose between giving up one small sugar-producing island in the Caribbean or all of Canada. And they gave up all of Canada. Now, Jews were particularly well positioned to take advantage of the opportunities that sugar trade presented. Jews were skilled in commerce. They were fluent in languages. They were embedded in trade networks with fellow Jews on both sides of the Atlantic. Those European powers, willing to stomach some kind of Jewish presence on their Caribbean colonies, stood to profit for that tolerance. And so religious diversity, to the extent that we see it, in places like Nevis, it's not celebrated, it is begrudgingly accepted in the name of cash crop cultivation. The status of these Jews was always precarious, especially as islands reach peak sugar productivity and the need for further immigration wanes. Jews are often scapegoats, especially in troubled economic times. Jewish merchants are accused of profiting at the expense of their Christian counterparts. Jews are often accused of stealing bread from the mouths of Christian children through supposedly deceptive Jewish trading practices. This is ironic because Jewish success in commerce was predicated on their ability to access credit in a world where credit was scarce. And that ability to get credit rested on their probity, on their trustworthiness, on their integrity. The geography of Jewish life in Charlestown, which is the main port town on Nevis where Hamilton grows up, that geography underscores how Jews occupied a separate and subordinate rung on the island hierarchy. Now, Jews were not spread out evenly throughout Charlestown. They are concentrated in a Jewish quarter. And this Jewish quarter, it's not the most desirable real estate on the island. It's sandwiched between a mosquito-infested backwater called the Bogs on one side and the prison on the other. This configuration is telling. In many parts of Europe, Jews dwelled in their own less desirable districts. In other words, Jews and Christians are not coming from Europe to the Caribbean and creating a whole new set of social and spatial relationships between the two faiths. They are recreating patterns they already know from the old world. Patterns designed to ensure a degree of segregation, cultural, religious, and geographic, between Jewish and Christian life. The site of the parish church in Charlestown underscores the staying power of these cultural mores. In many parts of Europe, there are regulations requiring maximal distance between churches and synagogues. Now, on Nevis, there is no such regulation, and yet they choose to adhere to this convention anyway, building the parish church as far from the synagogue as possible. Further testimony to the staying power of these norms that prized a division between Jews and Christians. Why have I taken such pains to reconstruct the fraught tenor of the Jewish experience on Nevis? Because it strains believability to think that the Jews of Nevis would have educated Alexander Hamilton unless they considered him one of their own. The stakes for Jews were too high. Their continued residence on Nevis, too doubtful. The politics with their Christian neighbors, too dicey for the Jews to have otherwise hazarded such an unprecedented risk. Now, when Hamilton is around 11, he and his mother wind up back on St. Croix. And she runs a store out of the first floor of a building, and he and his mom live on the second story. And this arrangement continues for a couple years until February of 1768, when both mother and son fall deathly ill. They suffer together in a single bed. Now, Hamilton pulls back from the brink, but Rachel Levine, in mid-February, takes her final breath. And the details of Rachel's burial and passing may be instructive for our purposes today. Notably, she's buried under the name Rachel Levine. She had not seen Johann for 18 years, and yet she keeps this surname until her dying day, hinting at an abiding connection to a Jewish identity. Interestingly, her death is recorded in a church register, which Hamilton scholars have taken to mean, seemingly reasonably, that she must have been a member of that church. But what these scholars haven't considered is that in the 18th century, states didn't start keeping civil records of deaths. That would only start in the 19th century. In the 18th century, states were using church records as de facto civil records. And so for that reason, churches were often recording Jewish deaths so that they could be used by authorities for civil purposes. And this is particularly likely in areas where there was not a synagogue with enough Jews to have its own records. And in fact, St. Croix had far fewer Jews than these other islands. Rachel, notably, was not buried in the church cemetery. Burial at a Jewish cemetery was not an option if you were Jewish at that time. As mentioned, St. Croix had just a few scattered Jews. They did not have the sizable Jewish community of other islands. There was no Jewish cemetery. Your only option was to be buried at the home of a relative. And in fact, Rachel was buried at her sister's estate. A number of Hamilton scholars mention that a Christian clergyman presided over her funeral. And this too might be problematic for my thesis, except there's not a shred of evidence for it. If you look at all the Hamilton biographers who make this claim and you look at their footnotes, they only cite other Hamilton biographers who make this claim. It's wholly circular. It is yet one more fiction in the mythology that continues to shroud our understanding of Alexander Hamilton's early years and kin. So if Alexander, in all likelihood, did grow up with a Jewish identity, when does he start identifying as Christian? Well, I suspect that any Jewish identity he might have had likely dies with his mother. At this point, he's no longer on Nevis, home to the large Jewish community that had educated him. His mother is gone. His communal and familial ties to Judaism were severed. A youth as plucky and precocious as Alexander Hamilton would have been disinclined to compound his troubles as a penniless orphan with a second-class religious status. And yet, Hamilton never forgets. No other American founder would do more to make the promise of equality real for America's Jews. But before we leave the Caribbean, let me share one more vignette from his teenage years that may lend further light on this question of his identity. Between his mother's death when he's 13 and the age of 18, Hamilton is living on St. Croix as an orphan. And a recently unearthed court transcript lends credibility to my theory that Hamilton was no longer identifying as Jewish in his teenage years, but he was also a latecomer to the Christian faith. When Hamilton is 17, living on St. Croix, he's called to give testimony at trial. And when he's brought to the witness stand, he is assessed by the opposing counsel for his competency to swear on the Christian Bible in order to give sworn testimony. And the lawyer asks, well, how do you identify? And Hamilton says, I'm Anglican. And the lawyer says, so you've taken communion? And Hamilton admits that no, he's never taken communion. And this is a real oddity for a 17-year-old at the time, because the Book of Common Prayer, which governs Anglican rites, specifies that the paired rituals of confirmation and communion are to take place in childhood. It would be an oddity for someone the age of 17, an adult by the standards of the day, to have never taken a communion. In fact, it would be such an oddity that the court forbids Hamilton from giving sworn testimony in that trial. He has insufficient bona fides as a Christian. And by the way, even decades later, when Hamilton was laid down on his deathbed with Aaron Burr's bullet in his spine, he had still never taken communion. Hamilton, in these teenage years, is working for an import-export company. He is, by virtue of this experience, thrust into the middle of these transatlantic trading networks. You look at other American founders, they grew up on farms, on plantations, they're versed in an agrarian form of economy. Hamilton, in his formative years, is learning about credit, debt, finance, trade, currency. He is honing all the skills that would uniquely position him to become the visionary of America's financial future. And owing to the large presence of Jewish traders in the West Indies at that time, it is all but certain that Hamilton comes into contact with precisely the kinds of Jewish merchants with whom he'll later collaborate in New York City. This arrangement continues until 1772, when a devastating hurricane brutalizes the Eastern Caribbean. The storm passes its eye directly over St. Croix. Amid the twin horrors of gale force winds and 70-foot waves, ships from the harbor are flung inland, homes are reduced to rubble, and the lives of hundreds of islanders summarily extinguished. The next day, the survivors find strewn amid the wreckage the corpses of their neighbors. The best surviving description we have of the storm comes from the pen of none other than an 18-year-old Alexander Hamilton. And his letter describing the storm is published in an island paper. And according to lore, islanders are so taken by his precocious facility with language that they raise money to send him to America. And he gets to New York and he enrolls at King's College, or what we know today as Columbia University. And when he gets to New York, Hamilton does something really interesting. He lies about his age. Every piece of evidence we have from the Caribbean, including Hamilton's own testimony in the aforementioned court case, places his year of birth in 1754. But Hamilton gets to New York and he tells everyone he was born in 1757. Why would Hamilton lie about his age? Well, King's College skews young. The average incoming student's only 15. It would be unsurprising if Hamilton, the outsider, the orphan, the West Indian eager to fit in, would have fudged his age to seem like he was at the same stage as other incoming students. The fact that Hamilton is diminutive in stature and boyish in face would have made the deception that much easier to carry out. So there are two lessons to glean from this revelation. First, Hamilton was perfectly willing to conceal some elemental aspect of his Caribbean past, like his year of birth. But even more importantly, he was able to get away with it for the rest of his life without any Caribbean contemporary of his ever exposing his falsehood. What Hamilton might not have thought through as a new college student is that if he gets to America and he lies about his age, for consistency's sake, he's going to have to maintain that fiction for the rest of his life, and he's able to do so successfully without ever being outed. This makes it that much more plausible that Hamilton would have been perfectly willing and perfectly able to obscure any Jewish heritage from his Caribbean past. So let us take a moment and consider an inventory of the evidence that we've seen. I know that there are people in corners of academia who will tell you, Porwancher, he's unhinged. He's gone rogue this time. He's a caricature from New Jersey trafficking in Jewish delusion. Well, I take comfort in the words of one of Hamilton's rivals, John Adams, who once said, facts are stubborn things. So let us take an inventory of the relevant facts. Johann Levine had a Jewish surname, a Jewish profession, came from an island with a Jewish community, is identified by Hamilton's own grandson as a Jew. After he marries Rachel, they have a son who is not infant baptized, which was standard practice for island Christians. He later undertakes a conversion to Anglicanism, and then Rachel has this other son, Alexander, for whom we also have no baptismal record. She enrolls him in a Jewish school at a time when Jewish schools exclusively educated Jewish children, where he begins Torah study in the original Hebrew. And then, as a teenager, despite professing to be an Anglican, Hamilton admits that he's never taken communion, which would be a violation of Anglican precepts from his childhood, and he gets to New York and he proves both willing and able to conceal foundational aspects of his Caribbean past. If we insist on adhering to the unfounded article of faith that these people were all cradle-to-grave Christians, these are really inconvenient facts. Hamilton biographers have glossed over these facts or used words such as shocking, mysterious, and inexplicable to describe them. Well, as my mother likes to say, when things don't quite add up, that dog don't hunt. And I don't know where she got that expression. She's a Jew from Montreal. I don't think she's been south of Philadelphia, but she does say it. I realize the notion that an American founder may have harbored a secret Jewish identity sounds on its face a little outlandish. But my book proceeds from the foundational premise of all research, which is that the best argument is the one that accounts for the most evidence. Now, I know that in Cleveland we've got an educated population here. We've got undoubtedly a healthy sense of skepticism. And so there may be people here who are thinking, you know what, Porwancher, if this were true, if this were somehow possibly true, we'd already know. How could a secret this significant about a historical figure this iconic remain hidden for this long? It's actually not that surprising for a lot of reasons. For one, Hamilton himself maintained a lifelong silence about his Caribbean past, even with his own family. For a statesman whose acceptance into the upper echelons of American civic life required at least a nominal pretense to a Christian identity, remaining taciturn about his Jewish roots would have been prudent, to say the least. Hamilton scholars have largely followed the lead of their subject in glossing over his early years. Their primary interests lie in the extraordinary events of his American adulthood. The task of recovering the obscure details of Hamilton's youth, it's not just a peripheral endeavor, it's also a fairly recent one. Even a basic fact about his upbringing, like his mother's name, remained unknown to scholars until the 20th century. It should come as little surprise then that his religious upbringing is an underdeveloped field of study. What's more, if you want to write about Hamilton's adulthood, those sources are really accessible geographically and linguistically. They're in English. They've been bound together in a 27-volume collected works of Alexander Hamilton, available at most any university library. You could write an excellent biography if you were just focusing on Hamilton's American years without ever leaving the Case Western campus. But if you want to write about Hamilton's childhood, you're talking about sources that are scattered across remote Caribbean islands and the European capitals of the countries that colonized those islands. And these documents appear in an astounding array of languages, not just Danish, but also Dutch, French, Portuguese, Spanish. The painstaking task of reconstructing the details of Hamilton's Caribbean past is hardly worth the effort. For the typical Hamilton biographer, whose native tongue is English, and whose principal interests lie in the American Revolution or the Constitutional Convention. And so vital facts about even a renowned historical icon can remain overlooked for centuries. The notion that we may have missed something major about an American founder shouldn't strike us as terribly remote. For a couple hundred years, rumors that Thomas Jefferson had fathered children with his slave Sally Hemings lent little to no credence until an enterprising scholar, Annette Gordon Reed, undertook pioneering research that, combined with new DNA testing, has led to a new consensus among scholars that Jefferson almost certainly did father children who were also slaves with Sally Hemings. So Hamilton's Jewish origins, by way of analogy, are no less real for having escaped scholarly attention for so long. Hamilton, in his American years, does not breathe a word about his past generally or a Jewish past in particular. And yet, Hamilton never forgets. His championing of the American Jewish community assumes a variety of forms. As mentioned, Hamilton went to King's College, and after the war, King's College reopens, and they've got to give it a new name. You can't have your alma mater named after a king when you just fought a war against a monarchy, so they rename it Columbia. And Hamilton at Columbia is instrumental in implementing reforms that are friendly to Jews. He helps do away with mandatory forms of Christian worship for undergrads. And this at a time when there were no Jews at Columbia. He changes the charter so that the college presidency is open to Jewish candidates. Now, if you look at other colleges with colonial era roots, like Brown, where I went, like Rutgers, where my mother went, they don't open their college presidency to Jews until the 20th century. Hamilton's 150 years ahead of his time. Hamilton is also instrumental in putting the first Jew on the board of an American college. Gershom Satius, who I mentioned earlier during the sermon, is the leader of Shearith Israel, New York synagogue at the time. And there had not ever been a Jew on the board of an American college. And in fact, there would not be another Jew on the board of Columbia until the 20th century. And it's a name some of you might know, particularly any lawyers in the audience. Benjamin Cardozo was the second Jew to sit on the board. He's actually a descendant of Gershom Satius. So I don't know why Benjamin Cardozo, he's always the second Jew to do something, because he's also the second Jew on the U.S. Supreme Court after Louis Brandeis, second Jew on the Columbia board. He's the ultimate Jewish silver medalist. Could be the title of my next book. Stay tuned. Hamilton, in addition to these reforms at Columbia, he is best remembered, of course, for his vision as foreseeing the future of American finance. Hamilton, as a young 30-something, only about 35, he's sworn in as the nation's first Treasury Secretary. And this at a time when the government was skeletal. Hamilton puts forth an audacious plan to revive the American economy, to give the United States the financial foundations on which our political project and self-government might well endure. He puts forth a plan for a national mint, for a central bank of the United States, to assume the state debts into a single national debt. And all of Hamilton's varied economic plans are interlocking. Now, most of Hamilton's contemporaries derided finance as the dark arts. They assumed, because they couldn't understand it, because they couldn't grasp Hamilton's prescience, that somehow he was bilking ordinary citizens and veterans and soil tillers. And in a bid to thwart Hamilton's agenda, his adversaries routinely reach for the cudgel of anti-Semitism. They accuse Hamilton of being engaged in some sort of unholy alliance with allegedly rapacious Jews who are somehow taking advantage of ordinary Christian Americans. Despite this opposition, Hamilton never relents in his affinity for and his alliance with the American Jewish community. And it is perhaps in his legal practice that we see most vividly his abiding commitment to the foundational principle of civic equality for Jews. Now, Hamilton, in 1795, even though there's still 2 years left in George Washington's term, steps down as Treasury Secretary. Why would he give up his position as the second most powerful person in the country? Well, it was the case at that time, and it's still true today, that if you are a talented lawyer, you can make a lot more money in private practice than you can working for the government. Hamilton had personal debts, he had a growing family, and so Hamilton leaves his post as Treasury Secretary and goes into private legal practice in New York, where he's able to quadruple his salary. And in his course as a lawyer, Hamilton takes on what's going to prove to be the most difficult case of his long career. And it's a hard case for a lot of reasons. For one, his client is a French merchant living in New York who's accused of fraud. And this at a time when it was widely feared that America and France might be on the brink of war. So a foreign merchant from a hostile power accused of fraud, not the most sympathetic of plaintiffs. The opposing party was two of New York's most respected businessmen. It turns out that their counsel is none other than Gouverneur Morris, who's been largely forgotten today, but one of the most venerated statesmen of his era. Morris had served in the Continental Congress in the 1770s. He authored the famous We the People preamble to the U.S. Constitution in the 1780s. He served as an ambassador for the Washington administration in the 1790s. And most problematically for Hamilton, Gouverneur Morris could be a devastatingly effective orator in a courtroom. If all of this were not enough on Hamilton's plate, he finds out that his co-counsel is none other than Aaron Burr, and the two of them are not on good terms. And if I've not yet convinced you that this is the hardest case of Hamilton's long career, there's one more thing you need to know. Hamilton's principal witnesses were Jews, and this at a time when it was widely and absurdly believed that the Jewish religion actively encouraged Jews to lie under oath in courts of law. This was an old anti-Semitic stereotype that had deep roots in European history and had migrated over to the New World. This case is litigated over a period of years. There's multiple appeals until finally it reaches the highest tribunal in the state of New York, the Court of Errors. And the Court of Errors is unlike any court we have today because it had representation from all three branches of government: the Attorney General, the members of the state Senate, and the justices of the state Supreme Court would all sit together as a jury, and whoever got the most votes won. Now, Hamilton's opposing counsel, Gouverneur Morris, in his closing argument before this august legal body, attacks Hamilton's Jewish witnesses purely on the basis of their faith. He alludes to them as, quote, these Jew witnesses, and he says flatly, and I quote, Jews are not to be believed upon oath. The next day, a large crowd gathered in the courthouse gallery to see how Hamilton, ever the relentless fighter, would respond. What Hamilton understood was that this case had become about something more than just a dispute between merchants. At stake was the very meaning of the Republic, the question of whether American justice would be blind to religion spoke to the heart of the Revolution and its radical promise of equality. The fact that a statesman as respected as Gouverneur Morris had resorted to political point scoring using anti-Semitism in court, it suggested that perhaps the lofty rhetoric of the Revolution was little more than a facade, masking discrimination. But Hamilton would not so readily relinquish his dream of equality in the nation that he fought to create. In Hamilton's own closing argument in court, he points to Gouverneur Morris and he says, has he forgotten what this race once were when under the immediate government of God himself, they were selected as the witnesses of his miracles and charged with the spirit of prophecy? Were not the witnesses of that pure and holy, happy and heaven-approved faith? Hamilton went on to say that no one should be judged because of the manner in which they worship. In Hamilton's own words, quote, be the injured party, Jew or Gentile, Christian or pagan, foreign or native, justice clothes him in her mantle, in whose presence all differences of faiths and births, passions and prejudices, all are called upon to acknowledge and revere justice's supremacy. The gravity of these words can be easy to overlook. After Jews had suffered the contempt of all ages and nations, here was a founding father demanding that in an American courtroom, a Jew and a Gentile stand equal before the law. Here is where we find the promise of the Revolution made real. Here is where we find the radicalism of Alexander Hamilton. When the final tally came in from the Court of Errors, by a vote of 28-6 against the odds, Hamilton emerged victorious. Let me say in closing a few words about what I see as the striking parallels between the story of the Jewish people and Hamilton's own. Jewish tradition teaches us that Jews were robbed of the land that God had promised Abraham. Amid the resulting diaspora, Jews were outsiders in other societies. In civilizations where power was rooted in land, Jews could not own land. Jews had to become intermediaries, tradespeople between societies. And those Jews who cultivated linguistic and financial acumen by virtue of their marginality, those select souls who made it to America in Hamilton's age, sought in this country a redemptive homeland. So it was with Alexander Hamilton. He too knew what it meant to live on the margins. He too developed skills in languages and in commerce in order to survive. He too came to America looking for his new homeland. Hamilton once wrote of the history of the Jewish people, quote, "The progress of the Jews has been and is entirely out of the ordinary course of human affairs. Is it not then a fair conclusion that the cause is an extraordinary one, that it is the effect of some great providential plan?" Perhaps Hamilton saw some divine intervention at play in his own unlikely rise from Caribbean obscurity to American founder. Precisely because Hamilton and his Jewish allies were outsiders, they were able to become consummate modernizers. In a world that was largely rural, they flocked to urban life. In a world that was predominantly agrarian, they engaged in trade and finance. In a world where loyalties often lay with your local state first and the country at large second, Hamilton and his Jewish compatriots believed in the promise of a unified American nation. It has been said that if you want to see a monument to Thomas Jefferson, you can go down to the National Mall in Washington, D.C., and there you will find, carved from white marble, a beautiful memorial honoring the author of the Declaration of Independence. But if you want to see a monument to Alexander Hamilton, look all around you every day. We are living in the commercial, urban, transitory, entrepreneurial future that he envisioned. What Hamilton understood was that the American future belonged not to the children of plantation aristocrats, it belonged to the itinerant, it belonged to the enterprising, it belonged to the immigrant, it belonged to the multilingual, it belonged to people like him. It belonged to people like his Jewish allies. If Jews were not yet fully accepted in the America of Hamilton's day, they surely could be in the America of Hamilton's dream. Thank you. Let's do it.
Thank you for another great session. Very enlightening. I have time for a few questions. Any questions? Ivan, stand up and nice and loud. We don't have a mic.
Okay. Sure. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for both of those questions. So I'll repeat both of them in case anyone didn't have a chance to hear them. So I'll take the second question first about Hamilton and slavery. And so there's a debate going on about the degree of Hamilton's involvement with slavery. And it's a really important question. I do talk about slavery in the book to some degree because slavery is so ubiquitous in the society. Even if you're not a slave owner, you can't help but be implicated by some degree. And so the best evidence we have suggests that Hamilton was not himself a slave owner. He did rent out slave labor from people, which was not atypical. Hamilton, as far as Chernow argues, is the most committed abolitionist of any of the American founders. And I think that the historical record supports that. And I think what people have to understand is that a lot of people who opposed abolitionism who supported abolition may have even been slave owners themselves. And so Hamilton is one of the founding members of the New York Manumission Society, the most important abolitionist society in New York City. And although Hamilton's not a slave owner, some of the other people in the Manumission Society actually are. And so it's a really complicated issue. He does marry into a very prosperous slave-owning family, and he also emerges from a Caribbean society where most of the people living on both St. Croix and Nevis are actually slaves by about a 7-to-1 ratio. And so he's absolutely surrounded by slavery, and he, in many instances, uses his political power, particularly in the courts, to try to fight on behalf of those who are enslaved. So this is a really important thread of the story. It's something I do discuss in the book. It's not central to the book because it's not as directly implicated with my research as others, but there are others like Ron Chernow who have taken it up more exhaustively. And then the first question was about George Washington and Alexander Hamilton. What influence might Hamilton have had on Washington? I'm so glad that you asked this question. I have a whole chapter in the book, chapter 7, that discusses this, and so I'll say a word about this. Washington is most famous in American Jewish history for the Newport Letter of 1790. And in this letter to the Jews of Newport, Washington famously says that the United States government gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance. And what is so striking about this letter from a historian's perspective is that it is the first time that a head of state anywhere in the world acknowledges Jews as citizens. And so it is of world historical importance, not just for American Jews, but for all of Jewish history. And there's this question that scholars of the early republic have about, well, who really influenced George Washington when it came to the Newport Letter? It's something of a mystery. And Jefferson scholars say, oh, well, it must have been Jefferson. And Madison scholars say, this letter feels really Madisonian. Now, it may surprise you to hear this, but I actually think Hamilton was the most likely influence on Washington's Newport Letter. And I lay out, admittedly, a speculative claim, because we don't really know, but I believe that Hamilton's the most likely contender for several reasons. One, no one else in Washington's orbit has closer ties to the American Jewish community. Two, Jefferson and Madison, as you'll learn about this in my book, were both capable of indulging in anti-Semitism in their politics and their rhetoric in a way that was not true of Hamilton. Three, there's a particular point made in the Newport Letter where Washington crucially draws a distinction between mere religious tolerance and genuine religious liberty. And he says, in America, we reject mere tolerance, and we have to embrace genuine liberty, genuine religious equality for all people. Hamilton makes this exact same point in his own writings. And finally, the Newport Letter is sent specifically to the warden of the Toro Synagogue, named Moses Seixas. Well, that's Gershom's brother. Hamilton knows the Seixas family in a way that I don't believe Jefferson or Madison did. And so for all of these reasons, I think Hamilton is most likely an influence on that letter over and above other people in Washington's circle. That being said, it is important to note that George Washington was a person of extraordinarily pluralistic instincts. And I believe that even if Washington didn't even know Alexander Hamilton, all of Washington's instincts were towards inclusion. He did not want to see America ripped apart by sectarian fighting. And in fact, George Washington writes a letter to every single synagogue in the United States at that time. And so I tell that whole story in the latter half of the Hamilton book for those who are interested. So thank you so much for both of those questions. Yeah, this is a good question. How does Hamilton observe Jewish life? And I'm glad that you asked that, in part because my answer is going to be really unsatisfying, which is that the historical record is really fragmentary. So when you're writing about the 18th century Caribbean, some documents have been lost to hurricanes, some have been lost to fires, some have been partially eaten by bugs. Many of these Caribbean islands, all of the money that they're generating from these resorts is flowing back to multinational corporations. They're not being invested in the local economies. And so they don't have the resources that we have at a place like the Library of Congress to preserve documents with just the right amount of oxygen and just the right amount of light so that they're saved for future generations. And so for all of these reasons, the historical record is partial. And for that very reason, I take pains both in my talk today and in the book to stress that the nature of my claim about Hamilton's Jewish identity is probabilistic. In fact, anything you could say about Hamilton's early years, nearly, is a question of probability rather than certainty. And so that caveat is really important. It's something I mention repeatedly throughout the book because I want readers to appreciate the kind of intellectual humility a scholar of the 18th century Caribbean has to bring to their subject matter. And so most of what we could speculate about Hamilton's Jewish life would be based on what we know from other sources about other Jewish communities in the Caribbean at that time. And so the Jewish community in Curacao is sort of the mother synagogue for other Jewish communities in other parts of the Caribbean. There are no surviving records of any kind at all from the Jewish community on Nevis. And so everything that we know, we would know as a question of analogy and inference based on these other sources. And so Hamilton's Jewish community would have been, if not entirely Sephardic, majority Sephardic. These are Jews who would have come from Portugal and Spain, who fled the Inquisition, who went to Recife, Brazil, and then got kicked out of Brazil, fanned out across the Caribbean. The synagogue would have been in the traditional Sephardic style. They would have likely had a Talmud Torah, or where Hamilton would have been educated. There's a question among historians about the degree to which Spanish Portuguese Jews living on the fringes of the diaspora adhered to different religious customs, partly by lack of opportunity, because they are on the margins of the diaspora, and partly because they had been living as crypto-Jews for so long. And so they may not have had the same kind of familiarity with Jewish tradition that, say, people living in Cleveland today have. And so there's no question that they're Jews. There's no question that they're studying Torah in Hebrew. There's no question that they're Jewish by any definition. But it is difficult to state with the kind of precision you or I would want exactly what the granular details of that daily practice would look like. So thank you for that question.
One or two more questions? Aaron, let's stand up.
Are there any other examples of the influence of Hamilton's early Torah education on any positions he's taken, any writings he had?
Yeah, thank you for this question. It's something I address in the book as well. So Hamilton may well have continued his study of Hebrew even in college. And so Columbia had a president who was teaching Hebrew just before Hamilton got there. He then resigned, and then they pick up with the study of Hebrew after he's there. But while he's there, he may have had individual tutoring in Hebrew. We're not certain. We do know that there are records of Hamilton as a teenager when he gets to the United States, where he's going through the book of Genesis. And there's a column where in one column he writes out the actual language in English of what's in the Torah, and then in the other column his own sort of editorial comments on what's happening with the origins of the world. And so he's certainly engaged with Hebrew scripture in that regard. And we also see Hamilton in his later writings as an adult rely on Hebrew scripture in making a political argument. So when Thomas Jefferson is swept into power, Jefferson also enjoys Republican dominance in Congress. Well, Hamilton's in the opposing party. He's in the Federalist Party. And the only branch of government that's still in Federalist hands is the judiciary. And so Hamilton really wants to ensure that the judiciary is safe from external interference from the other branches. And Hamilton warns that Congress is the Aaron's rod that will swallow up the judiciary if we're not careful. And so we do see him relying on the Bible to make a kind of political argument, which, by the way, was very common at that time. It was not at all unusual for Americans to frame political events in terms of the Hebrew Bible, more so than the New Testament. And that changes later, but in the age of the early Republic, many Americans saw themselves as sort of a modern-day kind of Israelite nation, and even looked to the ancient Israelite system of government as a model for what the American system of government should be. So there's a whole interesting history in what scholars call Hebraic republicanism. So thank you for that question.
If I can add, was studied with Dr. Jeffrey Tigay, who wrote the Jewish Publication Society's commentary on the book of Deuteronomy. And I remember when I studied with him in college, he put a slide of the original proposal for the seal of the United States of America, which was an image of the Exodus, Moses leading the Exodus through the split sea, and that was exactly what you can say a lot better than me, this idea of America as the Exodus and the new Israelite people. One last question in the back. Can you stand up?
Thank you. The question is about what has been the scholarly reaction to the book. And I'll just note very briefly to the rabbi's comment that I mentioned that seal in the book. So it's all in there. The question of how scholars have reacted. So there's been a really wide range of reactions. One of the things that's interesting as an author, when you put out a book about Jewish identity in America today, it's a topic that often cuts to people's emotional core. And people will sometimes have a reaction that's very favorable or disfavorable, depending, I think, on what their hopes and fears are. And so the book for many people has become a Rorschach test. And they see in it their greatest hopes or their most acute anxieties. Some scholars want to overstate my claim. They're so eager to say, yes, Hamilton was Jewish, that they say, Porwancher, you've proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Hamilton was not just a Jew, but a practicing Jew for his entire life, which is not what I argue. Someone who was a Sephardic Jew came up to me. You said, you've proven he's not just Jewish, but Sephardic. And so people will sometimes, in a way that's complimentary towards me, but a little bit untethered from the facts, will attribute qualities to the book that I expressly disavow. On the other hand, there are other scholars who I think have had a knee-jerk antagonism to the book. And the book has been criticized roundly in many quarters. And so one criticism of the book is that I am providing fodder for anti-Semites. That by saying that the patron saint of Wall Street was Jewish, well, we hate Wall Street and we don't like Jews, and here's this scholar who's saying, the father of Wall Street was actually a Jew, that's perfect, and they think that, I'm just giving ammunition to the enemies of the Jews. And my response to that would be that as a professional scholar, I have a paramount obligation to speak the truth as I know it, to share evidence and not obscure it. I am not in the business of hiding facts from public view, quite the opposite. And I cannot let the fact that some bigot may use my book as a distorted echo chamber for their own warped ideas preclude me from speaking the truth. There are a lot of people, for that reason, who didn't want this book to come out, partly because they are engaging in their own kind of gatekeeping around Jewish identity. They want to decide who gets to count as a Jew and who doesn't, and my book has a very complex take on Jewish identity. I suggest that there are actually 8 different kinds of Jewish identity. There's personal identity. Am I a Jew? Do I think of myself as a Jew? There's public identity. Does the broader public community see me as a Jew? There's communal identity. Does the local Jewish community see me as a Jew? Devotional identity. Do I adhere to the tenets and obligations of the faith? Ethnic identity. Do I descend genetically from the ancient Israelites? There are more as well. Cultural identity, legal identity. And part of what I show in the book is that there are a number of people, not just Alexander Hamilton, in the 18th century Caribbean at that time, who are Jewish in some senses and not Jewish in others. And there are a number of people out there, including scholars, who are really threatened by someone who's trying to complicate what it means to be a Jew, who is challenging their ability to gatekeep Jewish identity. And then there are still other scholars who are concerned because I think they don't like the idea that I'm stepping onto their turf, to be honest. And so people have made a number of claims where they're sort of reaching, where they say, this doesn't add up because, he says, Johann Levine may have been Jewish because of his name, but actually Levine wasn't a common name until the 19th century for Jews. Well, what they ignore is the argument that I make in my book that actually his name appears under Lavin, Luwian, and Levin, which were 18th century spellings, right? Or they try to claim that, Hamilton's school couldn't have been a Jewish school, actually, because he mentions that his teacher was a woman. And Jewish schools exclusively had male teachers. There were no female teachers in Jewish schools until the 19th century. And so the mere fact that his teacher was a woman means it could not have been a Jewish school. That's just erroneous. There is a rich academic literature documenting female participation in Jewish education going back to the 1500s. And so I could walk you through a litany of arguments people make that are untethered from fact in a bid to try to debunk the argument. And the fact that people have to mischaracterize my claims or make claims that are divorced from the historical record in a bid to rebut the book, I think, is actually the strongest indication that the argument is sound. Because if they could attack it on credible grounds, if they could attack the book on the merits, it seems that they would. There are many people who did not want to see this research come out, who tried to bury the book with my publisher before it came out, who have actively worked to get me disinvited from speaking venues. There are museums and other places in this country that were supposed to have me talk and didn't because of the pressure that they came under to rob me of a platform because they didn't want people like you to hear the evidence. They didn't want people like you to decide for yourself. They don't want people like you to know about or to read the book. They want to decide for you what evidence you're allowed to hear and what should be precluded from your view. But the publication has gone forward, the book talks have gone forward, the lectures have gone forward, and I'm hugely grateful to your rabbi, to your congregation, and to all of you for giving me a chance to share this story. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think Dr. Porwancher will stay a few minutes if anyone has a few more questions for him. Then we'll let him get a bit of a rest for the rest of Shabbat. Please join us tomorrow morning. We have morning minyan at 8 a.m. We have a wonderful brunch, breakfast spread at 9 a.m. And Dr. Porwancher will be speaking right here. We'll be streaming it. It is a special Zoom link. Check the email and website for the special Zoom link, 10 a.m. for his last presentation. Shabbat Shalom.